And briefly, RISC is the Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Risk Management Network. We started several years back under discussion with managers and conservation practitioners, Bethany Bradley Carey, Brown Lima, and myself, Toni Lyn Morelli. So that's UMass and New York Invasive Species Research Institute and USGS joining forces to, with lots of practitioners and managers and scientists in the region wanting to kind of create a community of practice around invasive species and climate change management. And you can go to our website at RISC and find all the information we've been compiling, putting together, synthesizing, all the discussions related to what managers and practitioners have told us that is useful. And this is our latest endeavor. So this is the first in a webinar series that is sort of a dialogue between scientists and managers, particularly to think about, in this case, species that are just on the horizon in the Northeast, either have kind of just arrived or will be arriving soon, more in northern New England, and thinking about people that are already dealing with a particular invasive species like Japanese Stiltgrass and people that are looking and it's on its way. So this is really meant to be a dialogue both between the two speakers and also for the broader audience of now over 70 participants we have on the call. And so we'll have two presentations. They're going to be fairly short. And then in the meantime, go ahead and chat any questions or comments you have. And then toward the end, after that, we'll then throw it all open. So we're going to have half the time to have a discussion about this topic and related topics. So with that, thanks, Carrie. Carrie put the website up, and there's also a form that you can put questions in. So somebody will pop that up soon, like magic, hopefully, into the chat box. So with that, I just want to introduce our speakers. Luke Flory is an associate professor at the University of Florida. His research focuses on the mechanisms of impacts of non-native plant invasions with a current goal of understanding the long-term consequences of interactions between invasive species and other potential global change drivers, such as climate change, fire, pathogens. The Flory Lab explores both basic and applied questions in diverse systems, such as the highlands of Galapagos, coffee ecosystems in Costa Rica, eastern deciduous forests closer to home, and pine forests and managed systems in Florida. Luke holds a Master's of Science degree in Applied Ecology and a PhD in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. Our second speaker, Angela Sirois-Pitel, is the stewardship manager for the Nature Conservancy, where she manages over 8,000 acres of conservation lands in western Massachusetts, where the RISC group, most of the RISC group sits, and also the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center that I work with as well. She has been at TNC for over 13 years and has extensive experience in land management, including everything from invasive plant control, preserve management, mobile data collection technology, and rare species management. She received a Bachelor's of Arts from St. Anselm College and a master's degree from SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, where she studied impacts of habitat restoration of bog turtles in Massachusetts. Awesome. So I'll let Luke get us started. We're so grateful for the two of you for giving this presentation and look forward to hearing your expertise.
Thanks, Toni. I'm going to share my screen here. I've got a PowerPoint that I'll start with some photos here. Okay, so you should be able to see a kind of a title slide here. Is that correct? Is that right, Toni? Okay, good. So just a little bit of background about myself. I grew up in Northwest Indiana and actually worked at a nature preserve when I was an undergraduate. That got me interested in invasive plant species just south of Lake Michigan. And so I kind of started on the management side in terms of interest and with my master's in applied ecology before moving into more basic ecology and evolutionary biology questions. And so I like to think of myself somewhere at the interface of basic and applied ecology, although I always like to talk to land managers as much as possible to see what their perspective is. So I started working on Microstegium actually by prompting from Ellen Jacquard, who was at the Nature Conservancy in Indiana, because it had become such a big problem in southern Indiana, or she thought of it as an emerging problem, and this is in about 2004, so 15 years ago now. I subsequently worked on both basic and applied ecology questions with Microstegium, and so what I'll do now is just touch on just a couple of highlights. I'm not going to show data or anything, but just kind of give you an idea of the type of stuff that we've done with Microstegium and kind of the way I think about the species as a problem. And so the first thing I'll say is that I don't call it Japanese stiltgrass. It's a misnomer. I call it stiltgrass, or more simply just Microstegium. I don't call it Japanese because it's native to most of Asia, and most of its range is outside of Japan, including the vast majority of China, Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, much of Eastern Asia. So currently distributed throughout most of the Eastern United States. I think it's in 26 states now, from a new population that I'm aware of, or a series of populations near Detroit, down to the panhandle of Florida, out to Eastern Texas. Of course, you all know in parts of Massachusetts, Connecticut, parts of upstate New York, although I know, or at least recently, some of the populations north of Ithaca were eradicated, as well as southern parts of New Hampshire and Vermont. So it's fairly unusual in that it's a warm season grass, so it does most of its growing during the middle part of the summer, but it's also highly shade tolerant. So some people say it may be filling this empty niche where most of our native species are C3 species that do most of their growing either early in the spring or late in the fall. Until recently, it didn't have many herbivores or pathogens documented on it, and so it's thought to benefit from this idea of enemy escape or enemy release. So it can invade a wide variety of habitats, and so especially in areas where it's first emerging or where it's first invading, establishing, you'll see it in disturbed riparian areas, along roads, along trails. And early on, at least in southern Indiana, people thought, oh, it's just a weedy species, it's a C4 grass, it's an annual. You're just going to see it in these disturbed areas. And that's where you first see it, but you can also see it in shaded, undisturbed forest. And you can see it in habitats from full sun, such as the wildlife opening in southern Indiana that you see on the picture on the left, to deeply shaded forest understories. We have experimental evidence showing reproduction down to like 5% light. So you see it commonly when it does invade more natural systems, so away from roadsides and trail sides and riparian areas. You see it in things like this bottomland hardwood forest in the bottom photo. This is Greenbelt National Park in Washington, D.C., just vast invasions of the species. And this is due to a combination of factors, I suspect. One is that, or at least three factors, really. So one is that seed is dispersed by water. It doesn't have any particular mechanism for that other than its small seed, kind of what you'd think of as a turf grass, and so it's easily spread into areas by water. It's inhibited by leaf litter, but if you have water scouring due to flooding, it removes the leaf litter, providing good soil seed contact. And then these habitats are kind of broken forests sometimes, or broken canopy forests, so there's a moderate availability of light, which is good for the species. So the top photo is in Southeast Virginia, similar type of habitat. This kind of not riparian exactly, but near areas that's maybe seasonally flooded, perhaps a couple times a year. This photo here, though, is a different situation. This is at Big Oaks National Wildlife Refuge, where I've done a lot of work. This is pretty far from water. It doesn't receive any scouring, doesn't flood at all. It's on a bit of a rise, and still a broken canopy, very, very dense invasions in this area. So again, a wide variety of habitats, surprising just how many different places you see Microstegium once it's invaded an area. So we've published a whole series of papers. I've just put a few on here about the impacts of invasions. You see this tulip tree on the left that's being kind of smothered, you might say, by Microstegium. We've documented impacts on native understory herbaceous species, soil microbial communities, arthropods, tree regeneration, a whole series of impacts of Microstegium. So one thing to keep in mind here, though, is you don't see the same impacts everywhere. Not surprisingly, some areas are really, really dramatic, and you can have Microstegium. I have photos of me holding some that's rooted in the ground, and when I hold it up, it's as I am, 6 foot tall. Other places, it doesn't get taller than maybe 8 or 10 inches tall, and it's very sparse, which has to do with the environmental conditions, including soil moisture and light availability and competitors. So wide variety of ranges of distribution and abundance, which translates to wide variety of impacts. I do want to highlight in terms of the spread geographically at a latitudinal scale, one possible mechanism. Actually, I said I wasn't going to show any data. Here's one piece of data. This is a project I did with Ari Novi when he was still at Rutgers University at Jean Marie Hartman. And what we did here was to collect populations from across the latitudinal range of Microstegium, brought them together in common garden, common environmental conditions in the greenhouse, and then documented their phenology. And in this case, I'm showing you how long it took for them to flower. And what we found is this very striking pattern where populations farther north flowered sooner, populations farther south flowered much later. And just to provide some little bit of context here, Microstegium was first recorded in 1919 in Tennessee. That's where it was first put in an herbarium. I don't think that's where it was introduced. It was probably introduced in a mid-Atlantic state. But here with the data, the populations that are the most south, lowest latitudes are from South Carolina, where the first frost is November. Whereas in Connecticut, the most northern populations, the first frost in September. And so what this suggests is that Microstegium has evolved to match the climate conditions, the growing season length in each of these locations. And the important part here is, well, one is that it has rapidly evolved since its introduction. And if this evolution continues, there's really little indication there'll be much of a limit to the northern spread. And so we might think of it as frost limited in some of these habitats, but it seems to be evolving to deal with those shorter growing seasons. The other thing is the longer until first flower, the larger the plants become, and not surprisingly, larger plants produce more seed. So there are implications here for both the spread and potential impacts of invasions. So the other thing I want to highlight, or one other thing I want to highlight, is the role of this abundant litter that you see when Microstegium senesces. And of course, in this photo here, Microstegium was really abundant during the growing season. So when it senesces or dies in the winter, you see this abundant thatch. And we've demonstrated that this can generate what is often called the invasive grass fire cycle. And so here you have an invasive species such as Microstegium that creates this dense continuous litter layer, very abundant fuels, that then increases fire severity and extent, and then causes greater damage to native species, but does not damage the invader, resulted in this positive feedback cycle between fire and invasion. And so we've demonstrated much more intense prescribed fires in invaded areas, which then have greater damage to trees that you may want to preserve under those prescribed fire conditions, even oak species that we normally would think of as fire tolerant. Okay, so the one other thing I want to highlight that I get asked about a lot is so in areas where Microstegium hasn't been very long, we often don't see these pathogens. We don't see it very often in the far reaches of the Northeast. But the idea here is that in the native range of Microstegium in China, we observed a lot of herbivores, and there's a lot of pathogens been documented. I don't have any good photos of pathogens here, but these are photos I took in China of herbivores on Microstegium. But in the invasive range here in the US, we often see Microstegium that looks like this with very few pests or pathogens, suggesting there's been some enemy release, that it's escaped enemies, and that's why, or at least partly why Microstegium is invasive. We don't really have evidence for that. Empirical evidence. However, in about 2008, 2009, we started seeing this foliar fungal pathogen. People got really excited about it as kind of a natural biocontrol that was maybe emerging. We eventually identified it as a bipolaris species. And we subsequently suggested that enemy invaders, that over time pathogens and other enemies may eventually catch up and have long-term effects. And I have some photos of examples where we know a thistle, garlic mustard, or kudzu. And so we spent a lot of time documenting the range of pathogens on Microstegium, and you see that the populations there in the Northeast, where many of you are, were not infected. That's indicated by the white circles. But throughout much of the central part of the invasive range, we see a number of pathogens, including the one in purple that we're now reclassifying as Bipolaris gigantea, or redescribing. And so we know, we've experimentally documented that there's some population level effect, or could be due to changes in reproduction of Microstegium due to the pathogen. But we don't really know the outcome over the long term for Microstegium and native species. And so that's something we're trying to work out now with a collaborative group of researchers, including plant pathologists and theoretical ecologists and field ecologists. And we're using these field experiments. This is a photo of the postdoc that's leading the field work in much of the modeling. This is some of the field work we're doing, manipulating invader and native density and manipulating the disease severity in order to try to predict the outcome for native and invasive species in these communities where the pathogens are accumulating. Something I want to point out here, a lot of land managers got really excited about the idea that we have this pathogen infecting Microstegium, and there are some that are adamant that this helped to cause decline of invasive populations in their areas. Unfortunately, this pathogen also infects turf grasses and infects corn. It infects a lot of other. I caution people to be too hopeful and to certainly not move infected material, which I know some land managers did. They even knowingly moved the pathogen across state lines, which is actually illegal. But it's an interesting ecological, and I'm very interested to see what plays out over the long term with the pathogen. But I caution people to get too excited about it as the solution to our Microstegium invasion problem. Then the last thing I want to say, and I really want to hear Angela's thoughts on this. This is from a paper that I did with a collaborator who is Nathan Kluczewski. At the time, he was at Purdue University, where at the time, and this is about 10 years old now, we put together our thoughts on different management practices, including pre-emergent herbicides, broad spectrum herbicides like glyphosate or imazapyr, grass-specific herbicides, and then some less practical things like hand weeding or mowing, control burning, biocontrol. And the thing I always come back to is the grass-specific herbicides. They're extremely effective. Native species come back. There's a number of different active ingredients you can use. And so I'm curious to hear what Angela has to say about this and other people that are on the call here. Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Luke. Yep, I think we're officially have the right science expert on the webinar for this. That's awesome. Before we move on to Angela's presentation, if anyone has any clarifying questions from what Luke presented, we'll have plenty of time to have general discussion. But if there's something that is related to a specific question about a method or something that you want to just ask about at this moment, you can unmute yourself or you can put the question into the chat.
I should mention here, that was I have a tendency to talk really fast and just throw a bunch of stuff out there, but our website is, my lab website has a lot of just general list of publications, which I can provide full text to anyone that's interested. There's some of them much more applied than others, and we've are doing a lot of work away from Microstegium now, but that's one place to go to get information. I'm also fairly active on Twitter.
Okay, and that's florylab.com.
Yeah, I put it there in the chat.
Great. Fantastic. Okay, I'm really excited to hear now from Angela, who's doing work on the ground with this species. So Angela, you're up. Go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. right. Can you guys, oops. Sorry about that, trying to get it on the other screen.
That's okay. If you go to display settings, maybe you already know this, but at the top there, it should let you switch. Got it.
You got it?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so yeah, to get started, thanks for pulling together this webinar. I'm hopeful that some of the information I can share will be useful to some other people who might be managing this. So to just give you kind of a quick outline of what I'm gonna talk to you about, just going through the history of my project out here in the Southern Berkshires, what we've been doing for control for like the last 7 years, talking about the challenges and lessons learned, and kind of where I hope to see the project going in the next few years. So Stiltgrass first became known to me in Mount Washington, which is the southwest corner of Massachusetts, in 2010. The person who told me about it said that they'd seen it up there for a number of years. So slightly frustrated that no one had kind of blew the whistle sooner, because I was like, what do you mean it's up there? And I'd known about other early detection species, but Stiltgrass was new to me. So pretty quickly I started doing some research and realized that this was not something that we wanted in our backyard. And this was the first of like new species for me to kind of come into our area. So in 2011, I did a lot of, we started doing some mapping along roadsides where we were finding it, and then a lot of research. And you know, so I definitely realized it was a lot more widespread than I thought. So, you know, here we show in the map, I have that, you know, we're seeing a lot of places in Mount Washington along the roads. And then surprisingly, we found it in Sheffield and Egremont, and specifically like really extensive in one of our easements in Sheffield. They had some logging a few years prior, and we're guessing that either it came in on the equipment, or maybe the log landing, the seed mix that was used on the log landing had Stiltgrass in it, because it's just completely, you know, covered the whole area. So we were pretty surprised to find that. So, you know, I got talking to my supervisor about what we should do out here, and she had suggested that we run this project through the New York Invasive Plant Management Decision Analysis Tool, which you know, some of you might be familiar with. It's just supposed to be used for managers to kind of help decide when to embark on a big control project like this. So I did the best putting in the information I had, you know, with the, you know, the data I had and what I knew about the species, to help kind of look at what a control project, what our goals would be, and our budgets, and, you know, the whole design of it. And then I brought that report to a group of my peers in Massachusetts to decide whether or not to go through with it. And even though we were, you know, there's a lot of unknowns, we decided that enough was known about how bad this invasive was that we should at least like give it a shot. So we did that summer, started initiated controls, and we knew at that time it was already, you know, especially in Mount Washington, so widespread that we couldn't control it everywhere, but we wanted to somewhat function as like an early detection rapid response. So we prioritized areas that we would do control, and then tried to coordinate with other people to do control on their properties, whether it was like, you know, neighbors or other partners, or, you know, the state and stuff like that. So basically from 2013 to 2018, you know, this past year, we've been doing control. And the first few years, I was doing a lot more outreach. 2013, I had a workshop in Massachusetts that I hosted for a lot of partners to just educate them about Stiltgrass. I, you know, reached out to all the road crews and DPWs in each of the towns so that they knew what it was about, and to, you know, make sure it was okay with them that I was cutting grass along the side of the road, and ideally coordinating with them to get assistance in that. Every partner meeting, I was like telling people, do you know about this? And especially our trail partners, because we knew that it was along the Appalachian Trail, and I, you know, was highly, you know, suspicious that it was being spread rapidly along the AT by foot traffic. And then reaching out to the towns, I did go and present at the select board in Mount Washington, because it's a small community, to just try to get them to be aware of this problem and, you know, support their road crews in assisting us in any way. So, you know, the 5 out of the last 6 years we have, or 7 years, we have done control. We've generally just been using TNC staff and interns to do this control work. And we, you know, this past year in 2018 was the first year we hired out contractors to do it. And that was, pretty successful. We didn't do control in 2016 because I went on an early and unexpected maternity leave. So there's no one here to coordinate any field work like that. So, we pretty much have just been going with the mechanical cutting, doing a weed trimmer, and trying to target that really narrow window of late August, early September, when there's enough vegetation to cut it down to the ground, but before any seed maturity is there. But we weren't really doing any specific like follow-ups to make sure that seed growth wasn't coming back, or that seeds weren't maturing on what was coming back. So the map on the left is what we had mapped for some occurrences in 2011, and the map on the right is more of what we're seeing out there now. So I had a crew in 2014 who had done much more thorough assessment along all the roads in Mount Washington, and we would basically the goal was to walk all the roads in Mount Washington and in our priority areas, and then also follow in any trailheads or streams or things like that to see if it was moving into any important places. And so we definitely realized it was much more farther gone in Mount Washington, which was that southwest corner of the state. And more than we would like to have seen in Sheffield and in Egremont, the other two adjacent towns. So one thing too was with our mapping was that we had switched over into different data collection systems. So we started using a new system in 2017 that is ideally better for mapping, especially in this scenario, because it allows you to map like an occurrence, and then you could do multiple assessments, so we could actually track how a specific occurrence or stretch of Stiltgrass was expanding or contracting. And you can map your treatment units as well, so you can kind of have all that information linked together. So we haven't fully merged all our old data into this new system, but I'm hopeful that it'll give us a better picture of how successful our treatment areas are actually going. And so the areas encircled in blue are where our focal areas have been. Again, we knew we could not treat everywhere. So in Mount Washington, our priority was to keep it really limited and controlled along the road frontage of where we own our fee lands and our easement lands. And if we could get partners and neighbors to control there, we would do it as well. On our easement lands where we don't, actually own the lands, if we knew that person was not going to be capable of doing control, we would definitely try to get out there and do it. But again, we had, limited capacity. In Egremont, we focused on some rare wetlands, and then where the AT crosses, we wanted to make sure to be hitting that. And then in Sheffield, there's, our largest preserve in the state, our Chenab Brook Preserve, which just has got amazing, like really rare calcareous wetlands and a lot of rare species. So that was a spot that we really wanted to make sure it didn't get a foothold down in there. So, some of the challenges that I've recognized in the last few years of this project, definitely like trying to tackle this at the scale of multiple towns with multiple landowners, just kind of regularly coordinating kind of who your contact is each place, and their last contact information. Do you have permission? Was it a one-time permission? Do we need to get permission every year? That has definitely been hard for me to kind of manage. I realized really quickly that we just had a really late start in Mount Washington. It was already much farther gone. It was definitely not an early detection rapid response program. And so just the success of our program there is going to be much different than it will be anywhere else. The timing and technique needed for doing the mechanical control has been challenging. Again, it's just a super small window that we feel like we can get out there where we can cut it, and it's tall enough that you can see it, and it's not going to regrow, and still be allowed to reseed and set seed and kind of make the work ineffective. And so just balancing, we own like 8,000 acres or manage 8,000 acres of land, and this is a project in just a few spots. And so kind of trying to balance, an important project like this with all the other stuff we have going on. And yeah, just like if we've tried to get out there earlier in August to have a larger window to do control, we just found that if we did go back and check, that often it was regrowing. Like the picture on the top left is a stem that had been cut. And so some of the crew that year went back out and they saw that seeds were still maturing on plants that had been cut previously. And so it was definitely reducing the amount of seed set, but it was not, definitely not eliminating it. And then the monitoring too, just the monitoring and the mapping component, like understanding where our current invasions are. Because of our short growing window in June, it's not really, you can't really see the plant enough, especially for new people learning how to ID it. It's a grass, so it's naturally much more challenging for people to ID. And then it's not really big enough in our area until July, say, to be able to ID it, especially if it's just a few scattered plants. So that early detection is super challenging. So we basically have July to be able to get out there and do monitoring and mapping. We definitely struggled kind of figuring out with this new plant what's our best structure for collecting data and mapping it. And, this linear distribution along roads was not something we were used to dealing with before. But the new system where we're able to now track like multiple assessments. So, we have this one occurrence, say, along a whole road, and we can see how it changes over time. We're really hopeful that will be really benefit our ability to track and treat. And then in some of the years, I wasn't as clear as possible to like that for my crews, that we wanted to know not just where they were seeing it, but where they were actually controlling it too. So that could have been better. And then even, when I looked back at the decision analysis tool that I had done many years ago now, I realized I had outlined that I wanted to do specific monitoring plots with transects and be able to really effectively communicate or understand how successful our treatments were. But it never happened. There was just too many other things to get to. And we did the more bare minimum of mapping what we know was out there and prioritizing areas for treatment, but we didn't get that hard data that would be, more beneficial if we had it. So what I feel like I've learned so far from this project, our control project definitely has not met exactly what we wanted to do. We did not eradicate it in Sheffield and Egremont. We didn't even really suppress it in Mount Washington, but I do feel like it's been successful to a degree because there's a few spots where we have not done management going forward because we thought it was too big of a site to handle, and we've just seen it spread so rapidly. So I know that where we have been cutting it every year, we are seeing less cover of the plant and it's more sparse, and so it is being successful where we're doing it and we're not seeing it spread as rapidly as where we are not doing it. So that's where I do feel like the effort we've put in has made a difference in at least holding the line and decreasing it where we have prioritized control, heavily. My original thoughts when I was doing the analysis tool to kind of project out what a 7-year project would look like, I had not worked with this plant before, so I was basing it on my experience treating like Phragmites, where if you hit it hard the first couple of years, you're only going back, maybe it takes you a day to retreat the same area that took you a week to do the first year. And I assumed I would have that decrease in the amount of effort needed, and that just wasn't the case. And I think it was because of a number of reasons. One, just that in some spots, if it was being cut too soon and it was reseeding on that little bit of regrowth, you're getting more seed set. There's obviously the 1 year that we didn't get treatment. So that's, you have your seed bank still establishing because of that. We're not treating it everywhere. So there's constantly going to be source populations that are going to be hitting these areas. And then, I think with retreatment, we're often like, you can kind of, if you've been to an area, you can kind of, with other plants, like walk in and see like, okay, there are all the stems of Phragmites, they stand up tall, or they're all the barberry shrubs. And here it's like, you have this grass that's now, if you've treated it, it's probably just sparse into all this other vegetation. So you actually have to walk slowly around the whole retreatment area to catch any few plants that might still be there. So we just didn't see we haven't seen the decrease in the amount of time needed to retreat areas as I had hoped. Again, timing is so key for preventing this, the timing of it being able to re-sprout or, regrow seeds on cut stuff. And in our area, because we were dealing with the Mount Washington's a plateau mountain, so they can be a week or two behind us. And so kind of running back and forth and checking on the plants in some towns, and are they ready to cut? Are they not ready to cut? Is it too late? And you can't, we would have to go up and do it because it's just, you're looking at these little seed heads on a grass, and we can't ask our neighbor to like go and check the population next door. So that has definitely been tricky for us. And I've decided in the last year or two, I've gotten much better records in terms of like just having one like email blast list that all of the people that need to know about Stiltgrass, like, hey, it's time to do it again, or are you going to do it? Like that's all, more consolidated, so I can be quicker and more efficient in reaching out to my partners and people that are trying to help with it. and just better internal reminders, and externally just the field season gets going and it's cranking, and then it's July and I'm like, oh my God, I haven't done the mapping, or I need to get the maps ready for the contractors, and trying to be more deliberate about putting those reminders in my calendar so I remember to send out the emails to tell people, hey, you're going to need to treat again, that kind of stuff. As far as contractors versus, TNC staff, there's definitely challenges in, exporting that work to contractors. One of the big things was that we kind of had this institutional knowledge about where the patches were along the roads. We remembered where they were from the previous year, and we had the data in our mobile devices right in front of us. If they were looking at like a paper map, it was easier for them to miss spots or not to know exactly where along the road that it was. And then, maybe their work wasn't as slow and detailed as, our work was internally, because we just have a different, mission going into getting every last plant. So we think it's better to maybe do a contractor can do the heavy lift in certain spots, but then there is a need either to mark the areas more clearly on the ground with flagging, or do follow up to make sure that we can catch any straggler plants if there were any. And then I wish that, I was able to just get better coordination and commitment from our partners and members in the community. A lot of people in the first few years were really like, oh my God, yeah, we'll help out and do it. And without my constant on them, this is really important, we have to do it, it just kind of waned. We were still committed, but I wasn't putting in the effort to keep up everybody else's commitment to it. So I think if I had had that, things might be slightly different in Mount Washington. I feel like in Sheffield and Egremont, I still have, it's still relatively limited there as far as we know. So I still think that there's pretty, decent hope that we can be more impactful in those two towns. So this is a screenshot of kind of where we were and where we are now. So this was a map that I had taken from EdMaps in 2012 when I did my data analysis tool, just so that I could show my team kind of what we were looking at in terms of when I was classifying this as an early detection rapid response, and that, we needed to do something. So this is the distribution map of the same area from this year. And so obviously everyone does not report to EdMaps, and I think this whole effort with Stiltgrass has made me try to tell so many more partners, you need to report to EdMaps. It's so useful. If you know something new, just especially if it's new, you should definitely put it in there, or whatever regional mapping tool, is used in your area. But we can definitely see that it's spreading northward throughout Massachusetts, places that it wasn't before. And we can only assume that there's a lot more out there than is being shown on this map, since we know reporting isn't, done religiously by people. So what I see for next steps for this project, because I do want to keep doing it, I'm definitely committed to doing it in certain areas. I want to reprioritize some of our control areas. I need to think, consciously about where our effort is going to be most useful. I focus on these areas in the Southern Berkshires, but we also manage a large landscape in the Westfield River Highlands, which is kind of between very Western Mass and Central Mass. And we're starting to see Stiltgrass popping up there. And that's a really relatively uninvaded area in terms of invasives. And I would hate for it to get a foothold there. So I need to think about those areas and be more dedicated to committing staff in July to doing monitoring. And I want to have better records in terms of where we're monitoring and not finding it, having those negative observations, so we know that it's not just that no one looked there, it's that it actually isn't there. And like I said, just IDing and marking areas for contractors, whether we're hanging flagging or spray painting in areas, to just draw their attention to areas that we've mapped as most important for them to work in. And then sending out kind of two phases. I think I'm going to send out of reminders. One, in early August, I would like to connect with DPWs and neighbors and stuff and actually give them maps of what we've found in that previous month, so that they know exactly where they should be looking. But then in late August, actually follow up, or when we know this is the time to cut, to send them an email and be like, go out and cut this week. Because I think that early August email, either they were then cutting because they're like, oh, they said, remember Stiltgrass, so we're doing it. And then they're like, but I did it. And they're like, but it's still there. And I'm like, oh, you did it too soon. And so to just try to help people fine tune that cutting window on their own a little bit better. And that we would still plan to use contractors in late August to do the work. And then, you know, in mid-September, what I think we'll do is that we will follow up in our priority areas where we had contractors do work to make sure that if there was any resprouting and reseeding, that we can get it, and that we can actually do the mapping of the treatment areas so that we can collect that data, since our contractors were not able to collect that data.
Thank you, Angela. That was fantastic. Such a wealth of information, and it's so awesome to see the experience, and I appreciate, I'm sure others do too, that you shared sort of the successes and the things to work on. So that's really helpful for everyone, I'm sure. I just want to put a quick plug in, and then we're going to start a more formal discussion. But something that struck me is we recently had a webinar 2 weeks ago where Talbot Trotter of the Forest Service and Elizabeth Rosemartin of the National Phenology Network talks about bringing research together with the phenology tracking system of National Phenology Network, and this and they're very, NPN is very interested in hearing, are there species where they could potentially model the timing and help inform when managers should get out on the ground and work on things. And this seems like a species that might be really good for that, especially so that you're not just like hitting refresh on weather.com or whatever and trying to extrapolate to other regions. So Alyssa might be on the call, but regardless, we can kind of get you connected up, and if that triggers anything for other people as well. So what I want to start our discussion is I'm going to have everyone's already on a computer, presumably, and I'm going to pop up an online poll. It's just a couple quick questions, and then we'll start talking. And so if you go to menti.com, and I will show this to you on my screen as well.
Maybe while they're filling out, we can go through the questions in the
yeah, I will. Thanks. Just a second. So you should be able to see this. Just go to menti.com. If you're on your, sometimes it's, if you're on your phone, it might be mentimeter.com. That should take you about the same place. And if you just it'll tell you, put in a code, and we're, you know, I realize there's crossover with what you call yourself. But sort of, are you more on the science and research end, or are you more on the practitioner management end? Just kind of curious about who's with us. And yeah, and as people are filling that out, Eve is sitting next to me and had a great idea. So we have, and Alyssa is here, so she says she's happy to work with folks. So Luke or Angela, here's a question. Has there been any sign of herbicide resistance to grass-only targeted herbicides?
I'll start here. One thing I wanted to just mention in terms of the biology of the species that directly reflects some of the challenges that Angela is having is that Microstegium has what's called a mixed mating system, where it has both cleistogamous and chiasmogamously produced seed, which means you see the potentially outcross seed. That's the seed, the flowers, the seed that you see kind of in the air, but it also produces seed in the leaf sheaths low on the stem. And so for using string trimming, you would actually have to and so one question I have for Angela is, why were you guys using string trimming? Because that must do incredible damage to the native species, and it's also not as effective as any of the herbicides.
Yeah, we considered herbicides. The Mount Washington is highly averse to using herbicides anywhere. So we knew that using herbicides on the side of the road would just not even be an option in that town. And then in the other priority areas, where we are seeing it is often in really proximal locations to our wetlands. And so the grass-specific herbicide, from what I recall when I did the research, it wasn't allowed for use in wetlands. And there is some spots that we probably could have used it, but because of the current kind of permitting and protocol system, it was going to be such a huge lift for me to even get permission to do that, that we opted to trying out this, multiple years of string, using the weed trimmer first to see how effective it was going to be. I think that there's spots that I definitely be open to trying it out, but again, they tend to be in wetland areas, so I'm not sure if that grass specific would be allowed. And it was, we cleared it, we would trim it down to the bare ground, but our sense was that by the time we were doing that trimming, most of the native, or a lot of it was just roadside stuff anyways, so it was not totally desirable, and a lot of the natives had already dropped seed by that point, so it wasn't as destructive to kind of the vegetation that was more desirable at that time of year.
Yeah. Well, it's just a shame. I've heard the same issue in other places, but the issue is that, it's not that it's desirable species. This it could be ragweed and it would suppress the microstegium. And I think we'd much rather have ragweed than microstegium. Mm-hmm. And if the kind of leaf litter stays intact, that's been experimentally demonstrated to be a major inhibitor of microstegium emergent success. And so I understand there's herbicide challenges in areas, but string trimming compared to pre-emergent herbicide, especially, we experimentally demonstrated 99% effectiveness. You spray an area, a plot, experimental plot, if you would spray the roadsides with pre-emergent herbicide in about this time of year or within the next month, when you go back there will be nothing, no microstegium, but all the native species that were perennial, they'd all be back and they would do a lot better, which would then further suppress the microstegium. Mm-hmm. So I totally understand the herbicide challenges, but the effectiveness is just incredibly different. I know somebody that's been doing string trimming 12 years straight in this one forest in West Virginia. And grass specific is the same way. You can use it at a really low dose rate, and any of the native perennial grasses actually survive it, and the native sedges, and then of course all the forbs and trees. And so I have some photos, I should have pulled one up, where you can actually see in a treated area, because we were doing small plots, you just see this flush of native species and surrounded by microstegium, because you've suppressed the microstegium with a single treatment anytime during July or August. So you have this huge treatment window.
Okay.
So, again, I'm not a weed scientist by any means, and so I don't know the regulations, but it's just incredibly effective to use these herbicides.
Okay. And do you know if they're allowed to be used in wetlands, or?
There's a lot of different active ingredients for grass-specific herbicides, and I'm not sure which ones or any which are used in wetlands, but you could definitely do those roadside areas.
Right.
The roadsides, the power line right-of-ways, the landing areas, the log yards, that's a classic situation with the log yard.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd give it a shot. And I can provide the publications that demonstrates the effectiveness if that's what you need.
Okay.
Cool. So Nancy Olmsted, can you unmute your phone and ask your question? I'd love to hear your voice in here. I don't know if Bethany, you can help with that, but. And in the meantime, I moved up the Menti to the next question. If you put your state in as a 2-letter designation, it'll get bigger than if you write it out.
Hi, this is Nancy. Can you hear me?
Sure can, Nancy.
Yeah, great. So I was wondering, for folks who are seeing Microstegium newly invading your area, I want to know what vectors you have observed so that I in Maine and others can be on the lookout for spread via those vectors.
I think mowing equipment, road grading equipment, somebody mentioned ATVs, that would definitely be one. Logging equipment, any of these long distance transport, it's going to be human activity. You see it along trails, and people are definitely bringing it on mountain bikes. Horse hooves are a big thing.
We've got some good discussion. Anyone that just answered that on the chat, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. I see we've gotten a couple people that have answered on the chat, and I can read those out, but it's nice to hear somebody else's voice as well.
Yep, all those things.
Yeah, that's a lot of stuff. Wow.
Sorry, Nancy. So, yeah, you can now probably see horses, tires, boots, ATVs, mountain bikes, hiking boots, small mammals, or mammals. That was a great question. Maybe not the answer you were hoping for. Prescribed fire equipment, there's one you could certainly control, presumably. So I'm gonna, go ahead.
It looks like a couple people are asking what the mapping system was that I was using. So we are using Esri's Collector app on iPads. And so TNC has designed, I mean, anybody can build certain GIS shape files and stuff to be used on these systems. And so what we had a team that took the Nature Conservancy's old WIMS system, the Weed Information Management system that was used for a while by people, I believe in like the late 90s, 2000s, and we modified that for Collector. So they're just a series of different shape files, or they're different feature classes that have like related tables connected to them, so that we can kind of capture and link all this information together. And then we have a kind of one of the GIS web architects that have built a website platform for the data, so that all of our data will be able to be uploaded directly to EdMaps and the New York mapping system, I'm forgetting what it's called, as well as we can generate reports and stuff from the data that of our invasives, mapping, control, occurrences, all of that. This new web platform will generate maps for us. So if people are interested, I can probably share some of those details with them. They can just email me directly and I can pass that along.
Thank you, Angela. So we have a couple minutes left. I don't know if I can't get to the web forums, Bethany or Carrie, but if you end up seeing questions in there that you can paste into the chat box, that would be really appreciated. In the meantime, is there anyone that's starting to deal with this that's on the line that would be happy to speak up? You can raise your hand and I can unmute you, but about anything you can add to Angela's experience of your kind of practice on the ground of dealing with this. Some of you have already shared in the chat box. When we have 85 participants, we have to endure a few moments of silence, but that's okay. This is a really fantastic conversation that we're having, and I think it's pretty rare to get together, so it feels great to me. I know Brian Keevan says in the chat they just started weed whacking and now they're thinking about maybe the herbicide. And we certainly have from that previous, you can see on the screen that, you know, about half the people are already dealing with this or thinking about it. Julie Richburg. Julie, can you unmute? Beware the people I know. I can call them. She can't. Okay. Maybe you see her question, Angela.
I do.
Far from the
yeah. So far, as the farthest we've seen it from roads has been directly linked to trails. So we're seeing it interior, like popping up on a trail, a couple 100 feet in or something like that. And the one site in Sheffield on our easement, like it's all along his logging roads, like everywhere that his logging equipment went. And then he likes to drive his tractor around his roads. So like, and that's where we started to do some control. And then we're like, this is just way too big, absolutely for trimming. And it's going to need an herbicide application, which I think, you know, is maybe something we'd look into doing, but it's hard to start thinking about spending money to control on other people's property, but it is important.
Right. Okay, and Bethany popped your email address in there for follow-up questions. Did we have a question in the room? Okay, I have one written here.
I'm curious about monitoring in general. How many people have been able to
speak up.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Okay. Hi everyone. I guess you can probably see me. I'm Eve. I'm a PhD student here at UMass. I'm curious more generally. I was curious, Angela, that you said that you had a lot of trouble consistently monitoring, and it's something that we in the RISC network have been kind of preaching pretty hard to get out there and monitor. So I'm wondering for some of the people who aren't dealing with Microstegium yet or are about to, have you been able to do any monitoring, or what's your process like as you prepare for the likelihood that this species shows up? Or for Angela or Luke, people that you've been working with in your systems?
I mean, I think for us, like, it took a couple of weeks for us to like build the in-house, like the search image for Stiltgrass. And so now it's like, now that I have it, I will just drive roads slowly. And I think that you can you're going to pick up on the big patches, you know, a clump here and there. You can definitely see once you have that search image. It's the smaller things that are more worrisome to me. And so what we've been doing is I've been trying to each year get a couple interns that I send out to scout our preserves, and they're looking for a variety of things, but Stiltgrass is on their list, and I'm telling them to target the trailheads, target where culverts are coming into our property, like stream, you know, things like that, where they're seeing maybe some kind of disturbance. So looking for all invasives, but then as soon as I know, I check EdMaps regularly, and I'm like, oh, something popped up that's on a stream that comes into my preserve. That's when I'm, being triggered to do those things. And so I was just really trying to encourage as many people to absolutely use like something like EdMaps for early detection, because it is so important for people who don't have it yet to know when it's coming and when it's getting close.
Thank you.
In the meantime, thank you. So in the meantime, we got some comments about from Southeastern Michigan to Massachusetts, which is also my life trajectory. So I have to point that out. But that deer also really seem to be the culprits, or an important culprit of bringing the species around. We also have somebody that asked about reed canary grass and if it's similar. I'm going to throw that to Luke, but also note that it was a species I think we thought about doing this webinar on. So as I've said, this is something we had hoped would work, and now I think we've proven that it does, so we'll do again. And if you have a topic you'd like us to focus on, let us know, and we'll do some matchmaking again. But Luke, I don't know if you see that question and you have...
Yeah, so again, I want to emphasize I'm not a weed scientist. You should always read labels, talk to extension specialists, talk to people that specialize in use, make sure you're following all the rules and regulations. Because I know the pre-emergent especially is restricted in terms of where you can use it. The grass specific is less restricted, but unfortunately it's easier to spray Roundup or glyphosate in broad areas than it is a grass specific. That's what we found in terms of getting permits for research on National Wildlife Refuge. Reed canary grass, I think, would be much more difficult to deal with as a perennial, whereas Microstegium, again, individual plants are incredibly easy to kill. There's billions of them. And so that's why treatment with an herbicide is also so effective, is because you can treat a really big area at once. I've seen people treat it like with booms on four-wheelers even, and treat big areas. They treated a 17-acre invasion in the Apalachicola area of the Florida Panhandle pretty effectively until they couldn't access private property, in which case seed production occurred and it spread back onto the Nature Conservancy property. So yeah, I think there would be a difference with reed canary grass and Microstegium.
I have done some control with reed canary grass using rodeo, so the wetland approved, and it's been a number of years since I've done that project, but I haven't had to control it in a number of years because it was pretty successful. And what we did was we mowed it in, I think, July, and then we sprayed it in August. So we did we cut down so it was less material. It takes away all that growth, and then sprayed it, and that's been pretty successful. But I know there's a couple different timings of techniques. Usually a mowing and spraying seems to be pretty effective.
That makes sense. And you could use rodeo or glyphosate. People were using a lot, I don't know if they still are, using a lot of glyphosate on Microstegium, but I always emphasize that the grass specifics are just as effective, and you get to keep so many of the native species that help to inhibit the emergence next year. The big difference is cost, right? Glyphosate is incredibly cheap, and the grass specifics, you know, I've only ever used it at research scale, but my understanding is it's very, very expensive.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm wondering if maybe one thing that we could do as a follow-up to this is to gather some more of that information. Luke, it sounds like you've got a lot of it that we could put together, you know, and send out to the risk listserv as far as thinking about how we can facilitate the permitting for herbicide use, given that it seems to be such an effective option. So maybe we'll get back in touch with you guys after.
Awesome. So perfect plug from Bethany. So now hopefully Carrie or someone will put a little thing in the chat box about how you would sign up for the risk listserv so you could get this follow-up information. Join the hundreds among us. Thank you everyone for this wonderful discussion, especially Angela and Luke for putting the time in to share your expertise with us. And thanks for the suggestions of a next webinar that maybe we'll do in the fall on Mile a Minute or Reed Canary Grass or something. And look to the work we're doing with RISC. We'll be in North American Invasive Species Management, NASMA in New York in September, October, and lots of other things going on. So thanks to everyone for your time. And thanks for your inspiration for our work. Oh yeah, and let's applaud. That's fun. You can't hear most of the 90 people, but they're there silently clapping. All right, thanks everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you, Angela.
I know.